afraid I won't be able to live up to all of those nice words that Dr. Kamrava has uttered, but it is nice to hear them anyway. I'd like to thank the management of Georgetown in Qatar School of Foreign Service, SFSQ, at least we used to call it that. I'm not sure what the nomenclature is now. And as Mehran mentioned, I've been around for a long time, and I was very happy and honored to attend some of the preparatory meetings before this institute, this program was set up, and including the inaugural celebrations, which was about 10 years ago, which were quite splendid. It's really a pleasure to be back here again, and now that I am retired, I have more time, and maybe I'll be able to come out even for a longer time sometime in the future. But I was asked to address some topic of current interest, and I thought I would focus on the US-Saudi relationship. I've been sitting in Washington inside the Beltway, the Capitol Beltway, the ring road that surrounds the nation's capital, famous for its parochialism and insularity, but also a very good listening post for what the political class is chattering about in Washington, the foreign policy community, the security community, the defense community, the lobbies, the Congress, the political parties, and so forth. And of course, as we have a very colorful and contentious presidential election underway, that has added to the mix. And much of that debate is focused on foreign policy and the Middle East, despite President Obama's wish that he could pivot away from the Middle East and work on Asia instead. You can't really get rid of it. It is too difficult a region. In fact, it is a region that, by my estimate, and I've been looking at it and living in it for quite a long time, I have never seen it in quite such a turbulent condition. And that condition, I think, makes the traditional alliance patterns, the traditional U.S. Middle East policy, all of this has to be sort of rethought and reexamined. And one pillar of U.S. Middle East policy, of course, has been the Saudi relationship, which has often been called in the past a special relationship. We have one very special relationship in the Middle East, as you know, and that is Israel. And we may come back to that. But it was often said, that we have another pillar, and that is Saudi Arabia. And I think the importance of Saudi Arabia in the American sort of conception of American strategic architecture for this part of the world was greatly amplified after the Iranian Revolution of 1979, when the other pillar, the Shah's Iran, crumbled, and a great deal of reassessment had to be done. So the title of these comments, and I'm really just going to give you a series of bullet points here, is the U.S.-Saudi Arabia relationship special or broken? And my argument is that while it was special, it is no longer special. But I will not go so far as to say it's broken. I don't think it's broken, but it is not special. It is under stress, and I'll try to explain why I think it is. So let me speak very briefly first about the history of this special relationship. Secondly, allude to the security dilemma or dilemmas that Saudi Arabia faces today. I think they're under a great deal of stress. Thirdly, a comment or two about how Saudi Arabia along with the United Arab Emirates, has led what many people would call a counter-revolution against the Arab uprisings that began in 2011, an attempt to try and restore an order, parts of which, of course, have crumbled. And that is an effort and a policy that has elicited, I think, considerable criticism, certainly in this part of the world, but certainly in the United States as well. And I think the concern over this counter-revolutionary strategy and how it is being executed explains partly why the special relationship is probably no longer so special. Then I'll say a couple of words with some trepidation about the Saudi domestic political situation. I do this with trepidation because I know there are many people in this room that are more intimately familiar with Saudi Arabia than I am. So I will have to confess that I'm more or less passing along the analytical work of others. But I want to dwell on it a little bit because I think concerns in the Washington foreign policy and security community about the domestic situation in Saudi Arabia are also, in a way, accounting for the movement to sort of reevaluate the traditional special relationship with Saudi Arabia. And then finally, if time permits, a couple of observations about the American reaction to the latest events following the Iran nuclear deal, the lifting of sanctions, and so forth, and the reaction of Saudi Arabia and I think other Gulf states to those developments. And my conclusion will be, as I've indicated, that the relationship is no longer special, but it would be an exaggeration to say it's broken. But what do we mean by the special relationship? Well, I think one looks back at history very briefly, and if anybody has ever read that fine and well-illustrated book that Aramco, now Saudi Aramco, published many editions of over the years, you get a sense of sort of the narrative of Saudi Arabia's founding, its nature, and so forth, and the very felicitous relationship with the United States. That's a relationship that began really after the First World War, had a lot to do in the 1930s with the discovery of oil and with the successful efforts of American companies with U.S. government assistance to extract or win concessions in Bahrain and Saudi Arabia, breaking the previous sort of British monopoly on these things. And so the beginnings, in the sense of the special relationship with Saudi Arabia, are not so much political as oil-related, economic, and it was, one might say, and I think many people did say, a beautiful friendship. Aramco helped develop the Saudi oil industry. A modus vivendi was established that allowed this engine of modernization to function without really interfacing with or let alone disturbing the traditional political culture of the kingdom. And so it was at that point that Saudi Arabia became very important, important enough for the U.S. to give lend-lease assistance to the Saudis during World War II when money was tight, but Saudi Arabia was important and would become increasingly important in the post-World War II period as the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union got underway. So we still often have, when we have lectures about Saudi Arabia, or people reminisce about the old days We have diplomats in Washington that had really good experiences in Saudi Arabia. You often see a famous photograph of President Franklin D. Roosevelt and King Abdulaziz ibn Saud on a U.S. warship in the Suez Canal having a famous meeting in, I guess it was 1944, just shortly before President Roosevelt died. And this was kind of a meeting at the top and sort of a symbolic recognition that this was going to be a relationship that was very special. And it became even more special as the Cold War went on, and it was, I think, characteristic of American diplomacy in the 1950s and 60s and really up until the end of the 1980s to think of three primary interests in the Middle East. The first of which was oil, and Saudi Arabia's role was crucial. The second of which was, or would become, Israel, and the American support, the political support for the Zionist project in Palestine was well established, became well established in the 1940s and grew and still remains extremely important in trying to explain the nature of American Middle East policymaking. So you had those two pillars, and the third one has now, in a sense, kind of disappeared, and that was to keep the Middle East free of Soviet communism. In all of these areas, except the second, Saudi Arabia was important. Saudi Arabia was important for oil, and Saudi Arabia was important in helping keep the communists out of the oil patch. And as for Israel, there was, I should say, a kind of a modus vivendi over Israel. The Israel lobby, the Zionist lobby in Washington, was always opposed to the Saudi-U.S. relationship, and until recently remains, very adamantly against it. And the Saudis, of course, insisted that they were as fervently committed to the Palestine cause as anybody else, but in fact, nothing much happened, and there was a kind of live and let live relationship. And even though the Israel lobby regularly opposed American military assistance to Saudi Arabia over the years, the lobby was unable really to break that bond, and in fact, the military linkage between the U.S. and Saudi Arabia continued over Zionist objections and continues to the present day. So one would have thought at that point that there were grounds for thinking this was a special relationship, and I think one important point about that needs to be made, at least in the American context, which is that the relationship, although special, was not deeply rooted in American politics, or in the American mind, or with the American public. The relationship depended upon a rather narrow spectrum of interests and expertise and influence, elites, basically, strategic elites, security elites, and certainly business elites who understood and fervently supported the specialness of this relationship. So over that period of time, the Americans, I think, were in some ways uncharacteristically silent in our penchant for criticizing what goes on in the domestic politics of other countries. There was not much knowledge about Saudi Arabia. There was not much interest in it, and I think that suited the interests of both the Saudi ruling elite and the American pro-Saudi, as it were, ruling elite. So it was special, but I think that has changed. And part of the reason it's changed is that this region is in the throes of what many analysts think is a long-term fundamental kind of social and political upheaval that is challenging the sort of accepted wisdom about power relationships and borders and so forth. And while I think it's fair to say that for a long time the Saudi royal family was concerned, had good reason to be concerned about its security issues, these concerns have become much more amplified in light of the recent developments. And I mention this because it helps perhaps explain why Saudi Arabia, uncharacteristically in terms of its past political and diplomatic behavior, has suddenly become a very active, maybe hyperactive actor in this region. Whether they're acting out of pride or confidence on the one hand, or whether they're acting out of fear is something that we can debate. But I think it is not really debatable that from a Saudi perspective, Iran represents an ongoing, very serious challenge. It's a bigger country. It's got so many advantages and so forth, and a record of past behavior that I think many in Saudi Arabia and elsewhere in the Gulf are extremely suspicious of in the era of the Islamic Republic of Iran. But there are many other issues. The rise of sectarianism, of Sunni-Shia antagonism, is an issue that cuts in many different directions, but it certainly adds to the tension and potential instability in the larger Gulf region, between states, of course, between Iran and its Arab neighbors on the other side of the Gulf, but also inasmuch as Shiite communities in the Gulf, in Saudi Arabia and other Gulf countries are seen as being activated and agitating and opposing the existing authoritarian monarchical systems. That is a problem. And of course, it is even more of a problem with the collapse of the Saddam Hussein regime in Iraq and the rise of a conflicted and confused Iraq, but one dominated by Shiite organizations and influenced by Iran. And of course, the concern of Saudi Arabia goes even farther to the west when it is considered that Iran has been acting badly in Syria and in Lebanon. So these are issues, and it's fair to say, perhaps, that there is a broad, not only political, but even kind of cultural and sectarian conflict that the Saudis, I think, are desperately hoping to win, but it's not entirely clear how one can win a conflict like this. And then we have, of course, the rise of ISIS. I have been told that there are people in Saudi Arabia and the Gulf and other places that really think that ISIS is an American creation. I have to say, in the history of conspiracy theories, this is one of the most far-out theories that I have heard. But it is there, and I think the fact that it is there reflects a certain ambivalence but deep concern on the part of the Saudi leadership about what to do about this. And there is, at least from American and European analysts, a sense that the rise of Daesh, previously Al-Qaeda and so forth and so on, has been, if not actively instigated, at least substantially supported from within Saudi Arabia. And that's one of the reasons that some American analysts are asking whose side is Saudi Arabia really on. But from the point of view of the Saudi royals, I think it's pretty clear that the growth of ISIS and related groups, which might serve certain Saudi interests in combating Shiites in one place or another, that this has gotten out of hand, and that ISIS makes really no bones about saying that they would like to go after the Saudi royal establishment itself. So what do you do about it? If on the one hand you are somewhat, at least indirectly, responsible for it coming into being, that's, I think, the prevailing view outside. What do you do when it turns out that it may turn around to bite you? So that's a concern. And we see, I think, finally, without going deeply into the questions of Iraq and Syria, but we do need to mention Yemen. And the Saudi-led military adventure in Yemen against the Houthis, on the understanding, which many people contest, that the Houthis are a cat's paw for Iran, is I think Americans would say this may be the Saudi Vietnam, that this is a hugely expensive, enormously destructive operation that in which there is no end in sight, and that is a concern. So when you couple all of these regional issues, almost on all sides, the Saudis look at Yemen in the south, they look at Iran across the Gulf, they look at Iraq to the north, and so on, and beyond a little bit, Syria and so forth. That's a lot. That is really a lot to worry about. So it is understandable, therefore, that they may have decided to launch this kind of counter-revolutionary program in the wake of the Arab uprisings, which seem to, I think quite properly, to have rattled the incumbent political establishments across the region, whether or not they were in states that actually have collapsed, like Libya, Yemen, Syria, and Iraq. But even in the states that have not collapsed, the reverberations and the shaking is, I think, present. And it would appear that when the Saudis saw this coming, they signaled their initial unhappiness when Mubarak fell, and the United States seemed to be okay with that. They decided that they have to do what they can to stabilize the region from their point of view, which in the case of Egypt is to restore a military, autocratic, and rather brutal rule and fund it. But again, it's an expensive proposition. And all of these security concerns are magnified by the fact, as we all know, that the price of oil is today below $30 a barrel, and the stresses and strains on the Saudi economy are beginning to be felt. And the old idea that I think many analysts of Saudi foreign policy had, that you could buy your way, you could buy security, is a little bit harder to sustain. In academic terms, the theory of the rentier state, which meant that basically rulers with an abundant exogenous source of income could basically buy off their populations by promising a kind of social contract and benefits and a good life in return for their obedience. This is harder to sustain when you don't have quite as much wealth to distribute. So the counter-revolutionary strategy has been launched, and it is not entirely clear whether this will succeed or indeed whether it should succeed. Is it a smart idea, really, to try and roll back the kind of broad-based social protest that erupted in 2011, and I think, although muted now in many cases, is a factor still to be dealt with. And that brings us, I think, briefly, and it has to be brief, to the question of the Saudi domestic situation. And here, I'm simply borrowing from some of the intelligence and analysis that has surfaced in the West and in Washington in particular. And I think there are two broad concerns about the basic stability of the Saudi order today. One, of course, is based on economic factors. When you have unemployment at a very high level, I don't have time to go through statistics, a young population, budgets that were based on oil at maybe $90 per barrel or $60 per barrel, now being well in deficit, budget deficits coming in at $107 billion, and so on and so on. A stock market that was down on Sunday by 5.4% in light of concerns about the lifting of sanctions on Iran and what that might mean. These are issues that I think alarm analysts in Washington who have always thought that Saudi Arabia was more or less, a rock of stability and order, and that, was probably, from an American point of view, a good thing. But the other element is political. And here, this is getting into sort of peddling of rumors, I suppose, but there's a great deal of chatter among the think tank folks and the government analysts in Washington about the new regime in Saudi Arabia, and in particular about the deputy crown prince, Mohammed bin Salman, who is breaking a lot of China, as it were, in Saudi Arabia with plans to drastically overhaul and privatize, some people say Thatcherize, the Saudi economy, as well as exercising military muscle, principally in Yemen. And so it was, I must say, a bit interesting and surprising that the German intelligence agency came out with quite an alarming assessment of the political stability in the kingdom. And rumors began to circulate about a certain prince who had written a certain letter calling for the other remaining sons of Ibn Saud to do something about this upstart in the name of preserving the kingdom. But Mohammed bin Salman, I don't know whether anybody here has met him, but our prominent columnist Tom Friedman of the New York Times met him and seemed to be duly impressed by his reformist agenda, a reform agenda that had nothing to do with liberalizing the politics of Saudi Arabia and very little to do with human rights or women's rights and so forth, but which seemed to be salutary in that it was going to shake up a stodgy bureaucracy and bring Saudi Arabia into living within its means, all very nice. But that said, there are many others who have a far less sanguine view about the deputy crown prince, and they're wondering if he is really, is experienced enough to know what he is doing or understanding the consequences. In a very interesting interview that he gave to The Economist that some of you may have seen, it was quite recently, he spoke about his plans for privatizing the Saudi economy, but as The Economist noted, he was very silent on the question of political reform and women's rights, And he denied, of course, that Saudi Arabia might be considered an authoritarian state. And he said, and this is the quote from Mohammed bin Salman, he said, "We are part of a national process. We are part of the local tribes of the country. We are part of the regions in the country. We've been working together for the past 300 years. And this indeed is part of the sort of the standard official narrative about Saudi Arabia, that all came together under the Al Saud in their coalition with the Al Sheikh, and a happy compact was reached, and so on and so on. That's what he said. But clearly there are doubters about what's going on there in the United States, and that is, I think, part of the narrative, part of the reason that the specialness of this relation is beginning to be challenged. Now, having talked enough about Saudi Arabia, let me talk a little bit about the U.S. And here, let's try to imagine the sort of the political landscape when it comes to how Saudi Arabia is understood in the United States, in the political system today. First of all, I think it should be noted, and this is important, that the traditional bulwark, the political bulwark for the close Saudi-U.S. relationship is still intact. And that has everything to do with business. It's true that the oil factor, that Saudi's oil predominance, of course, has now been much diminished. And there is a recognition, well, maybe that's not so important, so maybe we don't have to be so deferential to the Saudis and so silent about the things that they do, even though we find them very disturbing. So the business connection is still there, the defense contractors and so forth. There's there are a lot of folks that have a lot of material interests in keeping this relationship going. And I think, that is not likely to change. Having said that, my sense is that there's a rising chorus of hostile analysis and just sometimes hostile criticism of Saudi Arabia in important political circles in the United States. There's a gentleman who has been making a career of sort of trying to undermine the authenticity of the Saudi royals by the name of Ali Al-Ahmed, who has been around for a while, but I must say it was quite surprising a few days ago to turn on National Public Radio, which is an important outlet, and hear quite a lengthy interview with this gentleman without any kind of corresponding critique or any serious questioning of him. And he was really, of course, tearing into the monarchy and all that it does. And I think we find among some of the think tank thinkers, there are those who have, I think, felt for a long time that Iran was not being treated properly. Now, the other part of this whole story, of course, is the deep hostility toward Iran that permeated and still substantially permeates American opinion following the Iranian Revolution and the hostage crisis and many other things. And there was an acute awareness of all the bad things that the Iranians may have been behind. Having said that, the effort by the Obama administration and by the Secretary of State in particular to push through the Iran nuclear deal to apparently a successful conclusion, I think has unleashed quite a lot of what you might call pro-Iranian commentary in the American media and in the policy community. So you can turn on many a station and podcast, whatever, and discover that Americans think, oh, the Iranians like us. That's one thing. The Iranians like us. We know the Saudis don't like us, but Iranians like us. and they seem to be such nice people, and they have a great culture, and so on and so on, which is true. But it was not widely recognized. But now one senses maybe that it is. And at the same time, if that's happening, there seems to be more exposure and more criticism of the human rights violations committed in Saudi Arabia, lately, of course, over the 47 executions that took place and so on, so that many people are saying, well, you know, why should we have an ally like this that does things like this? Now, it's quite true that the Iranians may be equally nasty to their political opponents, but at the moment, I think the weight of, or the sort of the focus of opinion to the Saudi direction, again, sort of diminishing this notion that the Saudi relationship, the Saudi-U.S. relationship was sacrosanct and special. And so it goes, and I'll only, I think, really conclude by suggesting or asking, really, what are the implications of all this for American policy? And here, again, I don't want to be too alarmist about this, and we've heard President Obama and we've heard Ashton Carter, the Secretary of Defense, and other, particularly military officials, try to assure the Saudis and the other Gulf leaders that the American security umbrella, today's iteration of what was called the Carter Doctrine back in 1980, which said the security of the Gulf is a vital American interest, and we will do what we have to do. They're saying that, but clearly there are people that are saying, well, this is a more nuanced situation now. It would be good if Iran and the Arabs could somehow get along. We don't necessarily have to be totally anti-Iranian about this. And we would like, of course, to ultimately solve problems like Syria, and we need Iran. And it is, I think, must be very galling to many Saudis to see that John Kerry, the Secretary of State, seems to have a rather warm and friendly relationship with his Iranian counterpart, whereas I don't think he has that with his Saudi counterpart, at least not yet, who happens, incidentally, to have been one of our students at one time, but that's another story. So we have a presidential campaign unrolling here, and while I think that the relationship is not broken because there's a strong feeling that ISIS is so much of a problem, so much of a security issue, that we cannot be choosy about our local allies. And if you have doubts about the Saudis, and there are, you still, you're not going to, throw them under the bus. So I think that there is still a continuity there. The U.S. military has a long and close and intimate relationship with their military counterparts in the region. There's a continuing American presence. All the talk about the pivot to Asia clearly has not meant a zero-sum kind of situation, and the American military presence in the region remains very, very substantial. So that's fine. And then finally, we look at the presidential campaign. And I was curious to see what the leading campaigners for our presidential election later this year have to say. And here's what they say. Hillary Clinton, first of all, she has been attacked by her opponents because Saudi Arabia made substantial contributions to the Clinton Foundation, a foundation that does good deeds and good works around the world. But some of her Republican opponents have said they ought to throw that money back because the Saudis are, really not nice people, and they're trying to curry influence. Well, who knows? So there's that. But Clinton, although Saudi Arabia has not figured prominently yet in the campaign, still there's great discussion, of course, of the Iran nuclear deal. And Clinton's past comments on Saudi Arabia when she was Secretary of State suggest a certain unhappiness with the kingdom. Saudi donors constitute the most significant funders to the Sunni terrorist groups worldwide, she wrote in a cable that was released by WikiLeaks. And then just a few days ago, campaigning in New Hampshire, Hillary Clinton spoke about the execution of the 47 individuals in Saudi Arabia, and she said that raises serious questions that we need to raise directly with the Saudi Arabian government. But she also said, we work with governments whose values may be different from ours, but we shouldn't refrain from criticizing them. So, okay, that's perhaps a nuanced approach. Her Democratic opponent, Senator Bernie Sanders, who has turned out, he's somewhat to the left of her, turned out to be a serious candidate, to everybody's surprise, but doesn't know a lot and doesn't seem to care a lot about foreign policy, but he has said that Saudi Arabia and the UAE, he's criticized them for doing too little to fight terrorism. They're putting all their military clout into Yemen, which Sanders thinks is a total waste of time, when they should be, if they were serious about ISIS, they should be, putting their boots on the ground. And when they tell the United States to put its boots on the ground, the American politicians don't like that. They find that quite objectionable. And on the Republican side, where we have two major candidates who are very much right-wing populists, hawkish, both of them possibly more appealing to the Saudi establishment. If the Saudis were voting on this, they might vote Republican if Ted Cruz were to win, because Ted Cruz, who famously said that he would like to carpet bomb the Islamic terrorists until the sand glowed, has also said that we must build an anti-ISIS coalition. And that, I think, is quite compatible with what the Saudis are saying. And the other guy, Donald Trump, famous for his sympathetic and warm feelings toward Muslims, he said that he put that aside, and he said the U.S. would have to defend Saudi Arabia against Iran. So he said that, and that's something that would appeal, I think, to the Saudi elite. So from, I think, as the Saudis look at our totally bizarre presidential politics, who knows? But they may be thinking that. One thing we know they're thinking that Obama was feckless, as Prince Saud al-Faisal, who comes frequently to Washington, he's a Georgetown alumnus, has said more than once in public that Obama is dithering. And there, I think, is a widespread opinion that the Americans have dropped the ball. The idea of American decline takes on a certain resonance and reality in the light of American inability to sort of bring Pax Americana to the Middle East. So anything other than Obama may be preferable to the Saudi establishment. It looks to me as if the Democratic candidates are willing to sort of, what should I say, hold their nose and continue the relationship, although not in such a special way, while the Republicans are much more interested in reasserting an American role, if necessary, with the use of greater military. So there you have it, and that's why my conclusion is that the specialness of this relationship and the sort of taboo against really going after the Saudis in American political discourse is that's over. It's not so special. It's not going to be so easy. But at the same time, the idea that we're going to have a grand bargain with Iran tomorrow and have a diplomatic revolution, I think that's also very far in the future. I'm sorry to have talked far too long, but I will stop. Thank you very much.